Chapter 4. The Few Who Won. A devout Polish Catholic, Felix Dzerzhinsky, was once asked why he was sure God existed. "God is in the heart," the teenager replied. "If I ever come to the conclusion that there is no God, I would put a bullet in my head." A few years later, he realized just how alone humanity actually was. But instead of turning to a bullet, he found a new faith, vowing to fight against evil to the last breath as a revolutionary socialist. By age 40, he was clad in black leather, designing a reign of terror as head of the Soviet Union's secret police. This story of zealotry fits with the popular image of Bolshevism as a conspiratorial sect, singular and ruthless in purpose. The Bolsheviks took advantage of 1917's democratic upheavals, perverting the noble February Revolution into the excesses of October. That Stalinism had its roots in Bolshevism is no surprise. The extremism of men like Dzerzhinsky, confident the utopia they were building was worth any cost, made it all but certain. This narrative is neat and seemingly true. The system that emerged out of the October Revolution was a moral catastrophe. But more than that, it was a tragedy, and tragedies don't need villains. Consider Dzerzhinsky. His socialism was rooted in the humanist idea that the present hellish life with its wolfish exploitation, oppression, and violence could give way to an order based on harmony, a full life embracing society as a whole. The future executioner suffered for his beliefs. He spent 11 out of his 20 years underground in prison or exile, in the torments of loneliness, longing for the world and for life. Poor, tortured, imprisoned, and martyred, the revolutionaries of Russia seemed destined to meet the same fate as radicals elsewhere in Europe, only they didn't. After he'd spent half a decade in solitary confinement, enduring beatings that permanently disfigured his jaw, Dzerzhinsky's last letter from prison was resolute. "At the moment I am dozing, like a bear in his winter den. All that remains is the thought that spring will come and I will cease to suck my paw, and all the strength that still remains in my body and soul will manifest itself. Live I will." Dzerzhinsky, like the Bolsheviks as a whole, did survive, though many people who ended up in their custody had no such luck. In the merciless environment the party found itself in, socialism became about rationing scarce resources and squeezing labor out of workers and peasants. The socialist sense of history, the fact that the movement was consciously striving for a different world, was a source of many of its triumphs. But in the Russian context, it became a way to excuse the terrible human cost of development. However, the equation of socialism with Stalinism, a common rhetorical tactic among centrists and conservatives, is wrong, and not only outside of Russia. As we'll discuss, throughout the early Russian Revolution, more humane and democratic alternatives within the socialist tradition were fought for, and only defeated through force. Both sides of the Cold War painted Vladimir Lenin and his party as special, unique in their brutality or their model for revolution. But even as an underground movement, it is striking just how ordinary the Bolsheviks were. Lenin saw himself as an orthodox Marxist, trying to adapt the German Social Democratic Party's SPD program to a largely rural and peasant country with a weak civil society and mass illiteracy. The supposed proto-totalitarian smoking gun, Lenin's 1902 pamphlet, What is to be Done, does have unusual elements. Lenin calls for professional organizers capable of eluding the police and places special emphasis on the rule of print propaganda, for instance. But the pamphlet was not a blueprint for a radically different party. Rather, these were necessary tactics for a movement barred from the legal organizing and parliamentary elections pursued by Social Democrats elsewhere. As Lenin saw it, once Tsarism was overthrown, backward Russia and its small working class could develop along Western lines. As he put it in 1899, speaking of the SPD, "We are not in the least afraid to say that we want to imitate the Erfurt program. There is nothing bad in imitating what is good." Siding with the radical Karl Kautsky, Lenin took aim at revisionists like Eduard Bernstein for trying to change a party of social revolution into a democratic party of social reforms. To be a revolutionary, for Lenin, meant smashing the capitalist state. His was a politics of rupture. But his project, unlike the Blanquists he also denounced, was intended to create a workers' movement and place it at the center of political struggle. He did not set out to forge a hardened core of putschists. Lenin's frustration wasn't that workers weren't smart enough to flock to the party, but that socialists were underestimating workers. His goal, following the German example, was a merger of the two currents into a militant socialist workers' movement. Then, perhaps, if not by design, the Bolsheviks were forced by state repression to adopt a military-like structure that they would later take into power. But this claim, too, is dubious, as the Bolsheviks maintained a level of transparency and pluralism few organizations in much more favorable conditions have reached. Take the Bolshevik economists, a group Lenin criticized thoroughly in What Is to Be Done. He thought that they, like every other faction of the movement, deserved to demand the opportunity to express and advocate views. Lenin was hardly a genial interlocutor. Like Marx, he was a fan of personal invective. Still, the leader had to deal with not getting his way. Between 1912 and 1914, 47 of his articles were rejected by Pravda, the party paper. Dissent cut through Russian social democracy. No one's marching orders were followed without debate. It wasn't just other currents, such as the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, SRs, but dozens of shades of opinions among the Bolsheviks themselves. On important political issues, however, the main wings of Russian social democracy were not far apart. When the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks split in 1903, it was over small points of emphasis, not because of Lenin's supposed call for a professional vanguard party. When the 1905 revolution arrived, all parts of the movement fought side by side. Most Mensheviks, like most Bolsheviks, opposed the Great War, their clarity on the issue matched by few socialists elsewhere in Europe. In the lead-up to February 1917, they differed on the liberal bourgeoisie. The Mensheviks thought they would lead the first stage of the revolution. The Bolsheviks did not, but agreed that the immediate task of Russian social democracy was overthrowing autocracy, not socialist revolution. Only during the February Revolution did the Bolsheviks start down a different path. Lenin didn't leave social democracy. It left him. When he first received the news that the SPD had voted for war credits on August 4, 1914, he thought it was capitalist propaganda. His faith was misplaced. Kautsky wasn't a parliamentarian, but he was present at the war credit debate. He suggested that the SPD abstain from the vote, even as he agreed that Germany was waging a defensive struggle against an Eastern threat. Within a year, he changed his tune and vigorously denounced the SPD's pro-war leadership and the German state, but the damage was done. For more than a century following these events, the Leninist narrative was that Kautsky had been an ideal Marxist until almost the outbreak of World War I, and that it was his stance on war in 1914 and his opposition to the October Revolution in 1917 that transformed him from revered Pope of Marxism to a great renegade. In his 1939 obituary of the German socialist, Trotsky sounds like a scorned lover. "We remember Kautsky as our former teacher to whom we once owed a good deal, but who separated himself from the proletarian revolution and from whom, consequently, we had to separate ourselves." Kautsky had shared much with the Russian radicals. Modern society is ripe for revolution, and the bourgeoisie is not in a position to survive any insurrection. Such a revolution would be won by a well-disciplined minority, energetic and conscious of the goal. They sound like Lenin's, but these words were Kautsky's. There was, however, a growing gap between Kautsky's ideas and those of his Russian admirers. His notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat differed from Lenin and Trotsky's. Kautsky might have used language similar to theirs in the 1880s, just a decade removed from the Paris Commune and with his party still underground. But his thought evolved. He believed workers would win power through free elections, extend political and civil liberties, and radically reform, not smash, the existing state. Meanwhile, Lenin continued to look for inspiration to the Paris Commune of 1871 and the Great Revolutions of 1848 and 1789. This was the spirit that spawned the communist movement. A decade before the Great War and Kautsky's apostasy, the 1905 revolution in Russia revealed that Lenin was in step with his era. The great dress rehearsal came close to toppling Tsarism and gave birth to the Soviet, Democratic Worker Councils. Russia at the time was already pulsing with change. The final decades of the 19th century had witnessed rapid economic growth and social advances. Industrial production doubled in the 1890s alone. Horses and carts began to give way to vast railroads, and for a time, Russia even led the world in oil production. But Russia's development was highly uneven. St. Petersburg's modern factories represented little of life in an empire where, even in its European regions, only 1 in 9 people lived in cities. Though Russia was making progress in absolute terms, it was still falling behind Western Europe. In the countryside, agricultural development advanced at a glacial pace, failing to keep up with huge population growth. Land-hungry peasants pushed eastward from their traditional communes into the steppes. Rural poverty was endemic. With economic stagnation in the countryside and growing but still inchoate capitalist industry in a few cities, scarcity reigned and helped politicize Russia's small working class. The mass worker protests of 1905 caught the Bolsheviks by surprise. In October, St. Petersburg workers established a Soviet to coordinate their actions. The body soon became a kind of workers' parliament, with representation from a range of trade unions and committees. It was essentially a functioning local government, in a struggle with the Tsarist regime for legitimacy. Trotsky, not Lenin, shined brightest in 1905, neither Menshevik nor Bolshevik, but respected in both camps. He immediately grasped the revolution's significance. During the St. Petersburg Soviet's brief life, the 26-year-old delegate emerged as an unparalleled orator and theorist. By the end of November, he was elected its chair. The situation by that point was untenable. As feared, Tsar Nicholas II soon crushed the revolution and reneged on concessions promised to liberal forces. By April 1906, 14,000 people had been executed and 75,000 imprisoned. But the revolutionaries now had a taste of real power. The transformation of Russian social democracy was stunning. Immediately before the 1905 revolution, the Bolsheviks had just 8,400 members. By the following spring, they could count 34,000. The Mensheviks also drew thousands to their ranks. The revolutionary movement finally had something Lenin had been aspiring to for years: a mass base of workers. Attempts to mend the divide between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks would fail, but both factions had a sense that they had entered a new era and that the Tsar would soon fall. But no one came as close as Trotsky to accurately guessing what would happen next. Grasping the implications of 1905, Trotsky refined a novel theory of permanent revolution. Marxists had traditionally thought that revolution would occur in stages. The first would be bourgeois democratic, paving the way for peasant land reform and further urban industrialization, and creating a capitalist republic with freedom of speech and assembly. The new situation would allow Social Democrats to patiently organize for a second socialist revolution. The Bolsheviks and Mensheviks agreed on theory, but argued over the role liberal capitalists would play. Mensheviks thought they would be at the heart of a bourgeois democratic revolution, while Lenin believed workers could reconcile their interests with those of peasants and drive the process themselves. Trotsky foresaw a different scenario. Instead of a bourgeois democratic revolution, the peasants would defeat the gentry in the countryside, and the workers would conquer capitalists in the cities. This proletarian socialist revolution would merge democratic and socialist ambitions. In underdeveloped Russia, however, after the defeat of the exploiting classes, there would be no material basis for large-scale socialist construction. As a result, the revolution's goals would have to be furthered by an international revolutionary process. The dramas of 1917 saw Trotsky's vision vindicated, with one key exception. The international revolution didn't come. 2 years into the Great War, 3 million Russians were dead. The empire's economy was in ruins. And yet the army pushed ahead with futile new offensives. In February 1917, the stalemate on the front was finally broken by its victims. As in 1905, St. Petersburg, now Petrograd, and its working class led the way. On International Women's Day, February 23rd, women textile workers began a strike that spread across the city. By day's end, 90,000 workers were involved. By the next day, 200,000. A similar situation unfolded in Moscow, where workers protested against skyrocketing inflation and bread shortages. Nicholas II refused to make concessions until he was forced to abdicate on March 1st. The Romanov dynasty that had ruled Russia for 3 centuries was swept away in a week. The Tsar's fall was almost universally celebrated across the empire. What to do next was less clear. The Bolsheviks' doctrinal dispute with the Mensheviks over the liberal bourgeoisie would prove important. Though the Bolsheviks agreed with their more moderate counterparts that Russia wasn't yet ready for socialism, they wanted workers and peasants to take power and carry out the revolution's democratic tasks. But most workers were instead drawn to the Menshevik call to revive the Soviets, which would assert the interests of the oppressed but not seek to take over the state. Liberals established a provisional committee to fill the void, but it had little popular support. On March 1st, the day of the Tsar's flight, Soviet and liberal leaders came to an agreement for the creation of a new provisional government that would implement a wide range of reforms. Russia would have full civil liberties, with political prisoners released and the police and state apparatus transformed. Important questions about the war, land reform, and elections remained unresolved, but the February Revolution was among the most sweeping the world had ever seen. Yet, tensions quickly appeared. Sovereign authority could now be claimed by the worker and soldier Soviets and by the provisional government. Moderate socialists struggled to bridge the gap, believing they had to keep the bourgeoisie within the February consensus. Russia, after all, seemed far from ready for socialism. It was too underdeveloped, and its working class was a tiny minority. Socialism wasn't meant to be a way to bypass capitalism, but a successor built from its highest point. But those finally released from tyranny weren't going to wait patiently for Marxist schema to mature. Workers seized factories, and peasants divided up estates. Popular committees sprang up across the country. Rank-and-file soldier committees resisted their officers, and peasant organizations oversaw unsanctioned land expropriations. Authority in all its forms was questioned. The aristocracy was gone, but though it was supposedly a bourgeois revolution, the bourgeoisie was reeling. In February 1917, there were 24,000 Bolsheviks. Within months, they were a mass organization 10 times that size. For the time being, however, the democratically elected Soviets were still dominated by Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, SRs. Many saw those bodies as having more legitimacy than the provisional government. It's not hard to understand why. Prince Georgy Lvov, a link to the old regime, was the nominal head of state, and the conservative Cadets and Octobrists who ran the government were terrified by the revolution that brought them to power. They could pass decrees, try to restore order, and continue the war effort, but few would listen to their commands. On March 1st, the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies published its famous Order No. 1. It declared that military orders from the provisional government were to be carried out except those which run counter to the orders and decrees issued by the Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. With Order No. 1, the Soviet demanded a key component of sovereignty, yet it did not claim to be the functioning authority in the country. Moderate socialists still had faith in the provisional government, which had been recently reconstituted to include more left-wing forces, including Alexander Kerensky, himself a socialist revolutionary. The hope was that this alliance would promote calm throughout the country, creating an environment in which socialists could press democratic demands and negotiate an end to the war. For now, the fighting would continue, but it was to be strictly defensive and without annexations. The Bolsheviks themselves were split on how to relate to the provisional government. Returning from Siberian exile in March, Lev Kamenev and Joseph Stalin believed the new republic would stand for years, if not decades, and adjusted their expectations accordingly. Lenin, still in Swiss exile, was shocked by his party's complacency and organized a return to Russia. The day after his sealed train arrived at Finland Station, he presented his April theses, in which he reaffirmed his uncompromising anti-war posture and essentially embraced Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. Like Trotsky, Lenin thought that rather than let the revolution consolidate into a parliamentary republic, socialists should instead push it forward and build a republic of Soviets of workers, agricultural laborers, and peasants' deputies. This wasn't empty rhetoric, given that the Soviets had more popular legitimacy than the provisional government. Arguing against the tamer position of Kamenev and Stalin, Lenin said, "No support for the provisional government. The utter falsity of all its promises should be made clear." The die was cast. There would be another revolution in 1917. Trotsky was also in exile when the February Revolution broke out, rousing the workers and peasants of the Bronx on the other side of the world. After a perilous voyage home, he was prepared to join the Bolsheviks and play a pivotal role in the events to come. The reception to Lenin's April theses among many Bolsheviks was cool at first, but it did immediately find some popular support. Lenin also had an ally in the young Nikolai Bukharin, then on the left of the party. The Bolsheviks were still split, between those like Lenin and Bukharin who were planning for insurrection, and those like Kamenev, Alexei Rykov, Viktor Nogin, who had long wanted to reunite with the Mensheviks, and Gregory Zinoviev, who had a more moderate perspective. The latter wanted to replace the provisional government with a broad coalition of socialist parties. Lenin also didn't want a premature uprising that would leave the Bolsheviks isolated and vulnerable, like the Communards of Paris in 1871. As late as June 1917, he would stress that, even in the Soviets of both capitals, not to speak now of the others, we are an insignificant minority. The majority of the masses are wavering, but still believe the SRs and Mensheviks. But the party's radical appeals were taking hold. Workers and soldiers flocked to the cause, and some, inspired by slogans such as "All Power to the Soviets," launched spontaneous armed demonstrations in Petrograd against the provisional government in July. A crackdown followed. Trotsky was imprisoned for a time, Lenin fled to Finland, publications were banned, and the death penalty was reintroduced for mutinous soldiers. With the blessing of the Menshevik SR majority, Kerensky's provisional government claimed more power for itself. During his 2 months of hiding in Finland, Lenin finished a book he titled The State and Revolution. His argument with reformists was premised on a simple point. The working class cannot simply lay hold of the state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. Like Marx and Engels, he saw the state as a tool of class oppression. A tiny minority used it to rule over a great majority. The state was, unsurprisingly, bloody and repressive. Under the dictatorship of the proletariat and its allies, however, the great majority would repress a tiny minority of exploiters. There would be some violence, but by comparison to the prevailing order, it would be minimal. "We are not utopians," Lenin writes. "We do not dream of dispensing at once with all administration, with all subordination. But as socialism triumphed, the need for a repressive apparatus would dissipate, and the state would wither away." Many have portrayed the state and revolution as a false flag, a libertarian socialist document from the father of socialist authoritarianism. But it was a sincere work. It did, however, indicate how simple Lenin appeared to believe constructing a socialist state and having that state wither away would be. In power, the Bolsheviks would learn otherwise and horrifically transform themselves in the process. In August, it was the right's turn to revolt. General Lavr Kornilov, sensing the instability of the provisional government, attempted a coup. With no one else to call on for help, Kerensky appealed to the Petrograd Soviet. It easily beat back Kornilov through strikes and encouraging desertion among the general's soldiers, with the Bolsheviks playing a decisive role. The party's prestige reached a new high point, and Kerensky was forced to release its captured leaders. In late September, Trotsky once again became chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, which was now controlled by a Bolshevik majority. The previously small, radical party could now claim a popular mandate. The stage was set for the October Revolution. Yet, the Mensheviks and SRs had one last chance to head off a Bolshevik takeover. The mood in the country had swung even further to the left. It was clear the provisional government had no independent means to defend itself in a country that now had 600 radicalized Soviets. Among the Mensheviks, who were hemorrhaging support to the Bolsheviks, a left wing under Julius Martov was gaining strength. Martov was resolutely anti-war and in favor of more sweeping reforms than the provisional government could offer. His position was nearly indistinguishable from that of the moderate Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks and SRs could have stepped in and seized power as part of a broad front of socialist parties to create a constituent assembly and a framework for reforms. The Bolsheviks could have formed a loyal opposition to such a government or even joined it, as Kamenev and Zinoviev wanted. Yet, instead, the Mensheviks and SRs clung to the sinking provisional government, and even if they hadn't, the two parties were internally divided on the war. To many workers and soldiers, Lenin and Trotsky's insurrection seemed like the only way forward. With the Petrograd Soviet now under their control, Lenin finally convinced the Bolshevik Central Committee to adopt his plans. The single greatest event in human history, as socialists called it for decades afterward, was anticlimactic. On October 24th, Bolshevik units occupied rail stations, telephone exchanges, and the state bank. The following day, they surrounded the Winter Palace and arrested Kerensky's cabinet ministers. 1/6 of the world had been conquered in the name of the proletariat, with barely a drop of blood spilled. Did Lenin lead a coup? Though certainly not as spontaneous as the February Revolution, October represented a genuine popular revolution led by industrial workers, allied with elements of the peasantry. After the Kornilov coup, the Bolsheviks could claim a mandate for the action. They won support through their straightforward call for peace, land, and bread. The Mensheviks demanded patience from the long-suffering masses. The Bolsheviks made concrete promises. Following through would be another matter, but the Bolsheviks were the force most militantly trying to fulfill the February Revolution's frustrated goals. In the first months after October, the character of the new regime was not yet clear. The Bolsheviks didn't initially seek a one-party state. Circumstances, as well as their post-October decisions, conspired to create one. Immediately after the revolution, it fell to the Second Congress of Soviets to ratify the transfer of power from the provisional government. From 318 Soviets, 649 delegates were elected to the body. Reflecting a dramatic shift in popular mood, 390 of them were Bolshevik, and 100 left SRs, socialist revolutionaries who supported toppling the Kerensky government. Now transformed into a small minority, the right SRs and Mensheviks attacked the October Revolution. Even Martov denounced the Bolshevik coup d'etat, though he also put forth a resolution calling for an interim all-Soviet government and plans for a constituent assembly. Many Bolsheviks supported the motion, and it carried unanimously. Martov's plan would have created the broad socialist government that many had sought in September. Only now, in a more radical moment, it would be pressured into ending the war and bringing about land reform. But, as in September, the right SRs and the majority of Mensheviks refused to go along. They walked out of the Congress, ceding the revolution's future to the Bolsheviks. Martov still wanted a compromise and tried to start negotiations for the creation of a coalition socialist government. But just 2 hours later, with the moderates no longer in the hall, the Bolshevik mood hardened. The rising of the masses of the people requires no justification, Trotsky lectured his former comrade bitingly from the floor. No, here no compromise is possible. To those who have left and to those who tell us to do this, we must say, you are miserable bankrupts. Your role is played out. Go where you ought to go, into the dustbin of history. Here is Trotsky epitomized, rhetorically masterful, but tragically overconfident in the ordination of history. The delegates erupted into applause. Martov began to leave with the other left Mensheviks. A young Bolshevik confronted him on the way out, upset that a great champion of the working class would abandon its revolution. Martov stopped before the exit and turned to him. One day, you will understand the crime in which you are taking part. Almost exactly 20 years to the day, that worker, Ivan Akulov, was murdered in a Stalinist purge. We will now build the socialist order. Lenin's words just after the revolution suggested a radical course, but in fact, the Bolsheviks moved cautiously. Though they had popular support in a few major cities, they knew it would be a struggle to assert authority across a massive, mostly peasant country. They tried to make good on their stated aims. Against the old elite's resistance, worker control over production was expanded. Homosexuality was decriminalized. Divorce and reproductive rights benefited women. Land rights were expanded to peasants. Anti-Semitism was vigorously opposed by the state, and steps were taken to allow national self-determination in the former empire Lenin called a prison house of nations. When it came to the industrial sector, Lenin's vision of worker control wasn't syndicalist. The ridiculous transfer of the railways to the railwaymen or the tanneries to the tanners. In the long run, he looked to more coordinated, class-wide methods of ownership. In the short term, he wrote, "The immediate introduction of socialism in Russia is impossible," and argued instead for worker oversight of management, alongside the nationalization of key sectors. That wasn't the limit of his horizons, though. Lenin was impressed by the wartime economy in capitalist states. If planning in the service of chaos was already a reality, why shouldn't planning in the service of human need, under the watch of democratic Soviets, be possible? The push for mass nationalizations came from the grassroots. A contradictory late November order gave factory committees a legal mandate to have a say in production and distribution, though still asserted management's right to manage. Not surprisingly, it fueled disorder and further hampered production. Workers took over factories on their own accord. In many cases, these were honest attempts to restore production after capitalist sabotage or flight. At other times, workers responded to the chaos by hoarding supplies for private use or sale. Within months, the Bolsheviks would have to clamp down on such actions, as their immediate task was restoring basic productivity and order. It's clear that the government intended to maintain a mixed economy, that is, a continued role for private capital, at least until its rescue by revolutions elsewhere in Europe. But the confusion of the initial post-revolution months was exacerbated by the fact that Bolsheviks never clearly delineated who held power among the overlapping jurisdictions of factory committees and trade unions and a sprawling complex of Soviets, not to mention the central state. Centralization and the blurring of party and state were simple, pragmatic ways to resolve the dilemmas. On the question of the war, too, the Bolsheviks' plans ran into complications. The situation was urgent. Though fighting was subsiding in 1917, between the February and October revolutions, 100,000 Russians died on the Eastern Front. The Bolsheviks put out a call to all the belligerents for a just and democratic peace. If other nations refused, Lenin was confident that the workers of these countries will understand the duty which now rests upon them of saving mankind from the horrors and consequences of war. The decree was ignored by the other Entente powers, and for the moment, so was the call for revolution. Negotiations with the Central Powers began. Against Lenin's advice, the Bolshevik Central Committee turned down an initial peace offer. Left communists, led by Bukharin, wanted to continue the war and fan the flames of revolt across Europe. It was a grave miscalculation. Taking advantage of the strife within the young socialist state, the German and Austrian armies advanced, seizing a huge swath of land from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that followed involved painful concessions, cutting the Soviet state from key agricultural and industrial regions and putting it in a weaker position to deal with growing civil unrest. Yet, as Trotsky put it, having mounted the saddle, the rider is obliged to guide the horse at the risk of breaking his neck. The Bolshevik government rode on. As they imagined it, the survival of the first workers' state would be a boon to the revolutionary movements that would take power in more advanced countries. These states would then come to the Bolsheviks' rescue and help rebuild the country as part of a broader proletarian confederation. It wasn't as fantastical as it sounds today. This was an era of upheaval. Not long after the October Revolution, German communists launched a series of ill-fated revolts, trying to follow the Russian example. Newly liberated Finland saw its democratically elected socialist government dislodged in a bloody civil war. In 1919, a Hungarian Soviet republic briefly took power. 2 red years of factory occupations and mass strikes shook Italy. Soviets appeared even in Ireland for a time. The Bolsheviks still hoped for a breakthrough via the newly formed Communist International, Comintern, an organization that attempted to create Bolshevik sister parties in other countries. Yet it was becoming clear that salvation would not come from abroad. Lenin's party had gambled in the hopes of extending the February Revolution's gains and ending not just one grisly war, but all future ones. The gamble failed. Yet the most credible alternatives to their leadership now appeared to be, at best, a right-wing military dictatorship, and at worst, a form of Judeocidal fascism. Amid unrest and confusion, the actions the Bolsheviks took to survive would only exacerbate the party's worst tendencies. Attempts to undermine the Bolshevik government started the day it took power in Petrograd. The White Movement was the primary challenger, an unholy alliance spanning the political spectrum from right Mensheviks and SRs to extreme nationalists and monarchists. 13,000 American troops, along with British, Canadian, French, Greek, Italian, and Japanese forces, joined the Whites to aid their brutal domestic opposition. Facing long odds, Trotsky oversaw the creation of a Red Army and managed to triumph in a 5-year civil war that claimed 9 million lives. The moment called for hardened men like Felix Dzerzhinsky. He was installed as the head of the newly formed Russian secret police, the Cheka, and he would order his men to collect information on state enemies from across the Soviet Union. Interrogations were quick, and those who failed to dispel suspicion were stood up against a wall and shot. With Lenin's blessing, the Cheka grew to 200,000 strong and led a Red Terror in which half as many were killed. These horrifying acts were carried out amid history's most destructive civil war and a White Terror that murdered more than 100,000, many of them Jews and other minorities. Many Bolsheviks, too, seemed tormented by their actions. Dzerzhinsky lamented that, "I have spilt so much blood, I no longer have any right to live," which is, of course, not to excuse the Cheka's actions or the government that signed off on them. There were few external controls on the Cheka's arrests and executions. Collective punishment, state terror, and intimidation, all these were exceptional measures that became the norm during Stalin's reign. During the Civil War, the Bolsheviks blurred the line between actions taken out of necessity and those performed out of virtue. There was no clear bedrock of rights and protections that Soviet citizens could claim once the emergency of war subsided. Open debate within the newly formed Communist Party would continue for some time, and included factions pushing for democracy and worker power. But the broader political culture of engagement and contestation, sustained by a network of parties and newspapers that had survived underground for decades under Tsarism, would never return. A central problem was the lack of clear agreement on what the dictatorship of the proletariat should look like. The Bolsheviks focused on seizing power, not exercising it. Aside from vague sketches, they hadn't thought much about politics after revolution. With the exploiting classes removed from power, wouldn't the proletariat need a socialist theory of jurisprudence or institutional checks on power? Finding themselves in an unprecedented situation, the revolutionaries made it up as they went along. Communist policy during the Civil War reflected both practical necessity and ideological zeal. Years of conflict had disrupted agricultural production. Peasants had minimal incentive to send what little they still produced to the cities. There was a shortage of consumer goods, and grain prices continued to decline in relation to those goods. A black market naturally developed. Like the Tsarist state and provisional government before them, the Communists tried to stamp it out. They were even more ruthless, applying their class analysis to the countryside, which they saw as divided between poor peasants, middle peasants, and wealthy kulaks. The Bolsheviks hoped to maintain their support among the two former groups by focusing their attentions on the latter, but divisions on the ground were not clear, and the presence of armed requisition squads searching for hoarders only further disincentivized production. Despite the state's energetic efforts at repression and banning of private trade, it was largely thanks to the black market that Soviet cities survived the Civil War. Communist industrial policy also shifted in the war-communism period, 1918 to 1921. The government nationalized the entire economy, instituted rationing, and imposed strict labor discipline. Not even the moderate visions of worker control survived the return to one-man management in factories. Shortages of parts and raw materials slowed production to a crawl. Highly ideological initiatives, like the attempt to construct moneyless budgets, only contributed to the economic catastrophe. By 1921, Russian industry was less than one-third its pre-war size. The Soviet state's political base was decimated by that point, too. Many industrial workers died in the Civil War, while others left starving cities and took their chances in the countryside. How to restore Russian industry and how to revive the worker-peasant alliance that sparked the revolution, these were the questions of the day. The new economic policy, NEP, 1921 to 1928, was an attempt at an answer. The state retained control of the commanding heights of the economy, large industries, banking, and foreign trade, but legalized markets elsewhere. A tax on food producers replaced counterproductive forced requisitions, with peasants free to dispose of their goods how they wished once the tax was paid. The goal was to replace coercion with accumulation through gradual, unequal exchange. That would provide the necessary peasant surplus to expand industry. Rather than forced collectivization, many NEP supporters also looked to the voluntary creation of agricultural cooperatives that in time would outcompete what they saw as needlessly inefficient traditional peasant production. Politically, however, the NEP period was one of hardening, not liberalization. Party leaders feared that the peasantry's newfound economic power might morph into political opposition. Not only rival parties, but even internal Bolshevik factions were banned in 1921. There was still debate within the party, but the Bolsheviks made clear that they would not step away from power. For the moment, they did not seek to censor or control the arts and intellectual life. But it had been easy to fall into a one-party state during the Civil War. Then, with the war over, the task of reconstruction required people willing to pursue decisive action. One such leader, Stalin, rose to party general secretary in 1922. Lenin was wary of certain developments, but though he decried the party-state elites, abuses, and excesses, he failed to see that democratic reform was the only possible counterbalance. Approaching death, he warned specifically about Stalin, encouraging the party Congress to remove him, but his wishes went unfulfilled. Once Lenin was gone, Stalin used his position to target the supporters of his rival, Trotsky. Still, Stalin was not yet in total control. Debate within the party crystallized into three main camps: the left opposition of Trotsky, Stalin's supporters, and those around Bukharin, who now found himself on the party's right. Trotsky pushed for party democracy and other anti-bureaucratic measures, faster industrialization and collectivization at home, and aggressive revolutionary exhortations abroad. Bukharin was more cautious, seeking to continue slowly riding into socialism on a peasant nag. Stalin triangulated between the two positions, displaying a political savvy few knew the Georgian possessed. Trotsky saw the real danger not in Stalin's bureaucratic centrism, but in the risk that Bukharin's program would accidentally bring about the restoration of capitalism. Bukharin, too, took far too long to see Stalin as a threat. Yet, even had they united, Stalin might very well have still won out. He applauded the party men Trotsky criticized. Trotsky's call for industrial rejuvenation also hardly won him goodwill among Russia's peasant majority. And without the support of the bureaucracy or the peasantry, and with so many of the old Bolshevik workers dead or exhausted, on what basis could Trotsky hope to defeat Stalin? Confidence in the dialectic of history wasn't enough. Trotsky was removed from the Central Committee by Stalin in late 1927 and sent into exile shortly after. Until his murder in Mexico 13 years later, he remained Stalinism's greatest critic. Yet he couldn't admit that any part of the system he so despised had its genesis in the repression that he had helped engineer during the Civil War. Despite all the political turmoil, the NEP worked. By 1926, Soviet industry had surpassed pre-war levels, a remarkable turnaround from just 5 years prior. What to do with this new wealth was hotly debated. Should the nation invest in agricultural improvements and light industry or heavy industry? These choices weren't just technical. For a party that grounded its legitimacy in an industrial proletariat, continuing along the more peasant-oriented NEP route had profound political implications. With the left opposition eliminated and his erstwhile ally Bukharin marginalized, Stalin was free to answer these questions as he saw fit. For his part, he was growing frustrated with the NEP. Under Stalin's direction, the price of industrial goods increased, yet grain prices were kept low. Peasants naturally clung to their stock. Periodic crises of this kind occurred throughout the 1920s as industrial and agricultural prices fell out of sync. In the past, these problems had been alleviated through price adjustments and other policy changes. This time, however, Stalin made no such efforts. Instead, he sent police to commandeer legally produced and traded grain. Local officials who followed existing laws were dismissed. A new period of coercion against every layer of the peasantry was inaugurated. Stalin wanted a revolution from above. The first show trials took place, and the first 5-year plan was introduced. It called for the tripling of industrial output and investment. And then, without warning, millions were forcefully collectivized in massive farms starting in 1928. Planners thought this would permanently solve food supply issues. It had the opposite effect. Production fell dramatically, and scapegoats had to be found. Collective punishment returned, not just against supposedly wealthy kulaks, but now also against ideological kulaks, that is, those who opposed the policy. At least 6 million perished in famine, 1932 to 1933, and millions more would spend their lives in a vast network of forced labor camps. Many resisted the new serfdom. Stalin's own wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, committed suicide in 1932 to protest the policies. But there was no serious challenge to the dictator. Within a decade, a once vibrant, fractious party became a monolithic sect. Yet, if we can look away from the human toll, if only for a moment, we can see that the 5-year plan was a success on its own terms. The Soviet Union made incredible advances, largely in spite of forced collectivization rather than because of it. State planning led to a rapid rise in GDP, capital accumulation, and consumption. Of course, the economic breakthrough was accompanied by renewed and even more deadly political terror. A campaign of mass murder began in 1936, with thousands purged from the Communist Party, including lifelong Bolsheviks. Many of them were imprisoned as counter-revolutionaries, forced to confess to elaborate plots, and then executed. Stalin had used a food shortage to transform the Soviet Union from an authoritarian state into a horrific totalitarian regime unlike any the world had ever seen. His Soviet Union did help win the war against Nazism, but for every action Stalin took to defeat fascism, he took another to undermine the anti-fascist struggle, supporting the disastrous Third Period policy that directed communists to see Social Democrats as their primary enemy, purging the Red Army of capable officers, ignoring news of imminent Nazi invasion. At the end of the Second World War, the Soviet regime was deeply conservative, pursuing great power policies on a scale even the Tsars couldn't have imagined, along with episodes of mass ethnic cleansing. Under Stalin, the worldwide communist movement became a tool of Russian national interests rather than one of working-class emancipation. Dzerzhinsky, who fell to a heart attack in 1926, anguished over every execution order he signed. He was replaced by men with no such compunction. After Stalin died in 1953, the Soviet system changed profoundly. Stalin's command economy remained intact, but the bureaucrats who now ruled the country remained haunted by the terror that had cut through their ranks. The new order was gray and repressive, but capable for a time of delivering peace and stability and of making gains for society's most downtrodden. Yet the ruling elite ultimately had no interest in building a free civil society from which socialist democracy might have sprung. The Soviet Union's centrally planned economy, which had allowed it to catch up with the West, began to show strain. Soviet technocrats were remarkably successful considering the enormity of their task, but the inefficiencies of the system fueled popular resentment. Back in the 19th century, Alexis de Tocqueville had argued that the most dangerous time for a bad government was when it tried to mend its ways. Mikhail Gorbachev's years in office revealed the truth of the claim. His attempts to renovate the system only undermined the coercion that held it together. With hindsight, we can see that both the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks were wrong in 1917. The Mensheviks' faith in Russian liberals to carry out sweeping democratic transformations was misplaced, as were the Bolsheviks' hopes for world revolution and a leap from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. Having seen over 10 million killed in a capitalist war and living in an era of upheaval, the Bolsheviks can be forgiven for trying to chart a course to a better world. What is less forgivable is that a model built from errors and excesses, forged in the worst of conditions, came to be synonymous with the socialist ideal itself. Rather than a democratic movement ready to deliver on the radical promise of the Enlightenment, socialism became associated with stifling authoritarianism and an increasingly sclerotic planned economy. Across the world, communist movements, at least when in opposition, did find themselves on the right side of battles over civil rights, social justice, and colonialism. But in power, following the Soviet model, they instituted new forms of oppression. The mature Soviet system was a form of authoritarian collectivism in a world still largely dominated by capitalist production. But over the course of the 20th century, many of those capitalist societies would see themselves transformed by profound attempts to deliver doses of socialism within capitalism. In fact, a few hundred miles to the west of Moscow, democratic socialism came close to becoming a reality.